Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 12, where we are talking about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So, the first chapter that we read was From Problem to Participation, How to Become Part of the Solution. So, this may not be directly correlated or connected to the racial and ethnic populations that we're covering, but just like some more general considerations about your participation in systems. So this chapter says we can move from merely recognizing privilege and oppression to actually participating in change. The author's main premise is that none of us can avoid being part of the problem, but we can choose to be part of the solution. So this chapter starts by saying we aren't one uniform we, a straight white woman, a gay black teenager, a disabled Latino lawyer, a native teacher on a reservation. Each of these people faces the system from a different angle. That means our options and our risks are different. Some of us have privilege that gives us extra credibility. Others pay more for speaking up. So the chapter asks us to keep shifting perspectives by asking, if I look from another part of my identity, does this apply to me now? One obstacle to action is the feeling that patriarchy or white supremacy or capitalism are permanent. The author reminds us they are not. Male privilege, for example, is thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years old. White privilege is even newer. Systems only exist because people keep doing them. So if people can do them, people can also do them differently. The chapter brings back the idea of paths of least resistance that we have talked about before. Every situation has a default behavior. What won't get you in trouble? What won't make people tense? When we follow that path, we help the system keep going. When we step off it, ask a question, name a bias, support someone publicly, we create friction. That friction is how systems start to shift. Another myth is this problem is way bigger than me, so there's no point. The author uses Gandhi's paradox. No single act is enough, but it's still vitally important to act. To accept that, we have to stop measuring impact only by what we see in our own lifetime. Social systems move on a longer timeline than our lives. Our job is to add our stubborn ounces to the scale. The author gives a concrete example. You're in a hiring meeting, someone says, not a good fit, and everyone nods. One person asking, can you define not a good fit? Breaks the illusion of consensus. That tiny act shows everyone that bias is operating. So our problem usually isn't that we can't make a difference, it's that we don't dare to matter. This chapter compares this to science. Old paradigms don't fall because one person has a better idea. They fall because there are too many exceptions. Socially, when people openly model non-sexist, anti-racist, anti-ableist behavior, we become anomalies the old system can't easily explain. Over time, that makes the oppressive way look less natural and less inevitable. So, what do we actually do? The author starts very plainly. First, admit the system is there. Systems of privilege depend on everyone acting like they're invisible. Second, stay awake to it, because culture will put you back to sleep. Third, read and listen beyond the mainstream. Corporate media rarely dig into how privilege actually works. A really useful part of this chapter is about being confronted. A Black student told the author he interrupted her more than white students. He could have said, "You're too sensitive," or "I didn't mean it." Instead, he said, "I didn't realize I was doing that, but I have to assume you're not making it up, and I'll work to stop." That's the model. Don't make it about protecting your self-image. Make it about repairing the impact. The chapter emphasizes small public risks. Don't laugh at a racist or sexist joke. Write the email about the headline that trivializes harassment. At a meeting, back up the person who challenged the status quo in the moment, not privately later. Every oppressive system depends on silence. Every time we refuse silence, we make it itch. The author says, words matter. Diversity can just mean lots of different people in the room. Equity and justice force us to talk about power, access, and harm. Also, keep bringing people back to the system individual loop. If we reduce everything to a few bad people, we let the system disappear. So connect the system to the people. Another key point, don't do this alone. Social change is collective. The author cites Frederick Douglass. Organize, organize, organize. Also, if you're in a dominant group, part of your work is talking to your group. Men talking to men. White people talking to white people. Non-disabled to non-disabled. That takes pressure off marginalized people to do all the educating. This chapter also warns us not to treat one form of oppression as the only one. A system organized around domination will reproduce domination across gender, race, class, disability, sexuality, etc. So simply getting a few women or people of color into elite positions doesn't dismantle the underlying logic. We have to keep looking at the shared roots. The author is realistic. This is uncomfortable. People in power don't usually change because we asked nicely. So some disruption, some awkwardness is part of the job. Our silence is read as approval, so silence helps the system. That's why the chapter ends with stories about just keep going. We act without knowing when the bull will fall, but it will fall. The deepest point is we don't get to choose whether we're involved, but living in these systems, we already are. Our only real choice is how to be involved, by colluding or by interrupting. The interruption doesn't have to be heroic. It can be the small, stubborn ounces we add over and over. So the second reading, the article, was about the dominant value systems of Chinese gay males in family, couple, and community relationships. So this is Lin's 2016 qualitative study on Chinese gay men and their family, couple, and community relationships. The central question in this article is, what cultural schemas do Chinese gay men learn, and how do they then reproduce those schemas in their relationships? So I'll go over the findings and connect them to some clinical implications, especially around cultural competence. So Lin points out that if we take even a conservative prevalence, we're talking about roughly 27 million Chinese gay men worldwide, but we have very few studies that actually describe their family, couple, and community dynamics. At the same time, most clinicians in mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong are trained on Western heterosexual-centered models, so they often don't see the cultural layering these men are navigating. Lin's explicit goal is to give therapists a framework so they don't mislabel culture as pathology. Lin uses two lenses. First, social learning theory, where people repeat what's rewarded and avoid what's punished. So over time, they build social schemas or social beliefs, belief systems. Second, symbolic interactionism. Meanings about being Chinese, being male, and being gay are negotiated in interaction. To this study, Lin interviewed 14 Chinese gay men across several Chinese-speaking contexts using 60 to 90-minute semi-structured interviews over Skype or WeChat. Then he used a phenomenological approach, reading, clustering, theming to pull out common patterns. The big takeaway is that Chinese gay men aren't operating from three unrelated rule books. They're drawing on one dominant value system rooted in Confucian and collectivist expectations, and then applying it across family, couple, and community life. Being male and being gay add further filters, but the base code is still Chinese: hierarchy, harmony, filial piety, and group priority. First, the first theme is masculinism. Participants said they were raised on very traditional male expectations: be strong, be responsible, carry on the family line. When they realized they were gay, men felt immediate guilt because same-sex partnership can't easily produce a biological heir. That masculinism then reappears in gay couples. You see rigid top-bottom roles, or an older an older partner caring for a younger partner, and those roles are ranked. Masculine presentations are rewarded. Feminine men talked about being called sissy and being marginalized even inside the gay community. The second theme was exam-oriented education. Participants said they grew up with the idea that for every problem, there's one correct answer, and you get punished for the wrong one. That logic gets mapped onto sexuality. Not marrying a woman can feel like giving the wrong answer. In relationships, wanting an open relationship clashes with the standard monogamous template. So men blame themselves. Even in the gay community, they described pressure to fit into neat, appearance-based categories instead of just being themselves. The third and fourth themes were status and indirectness. So third, status. In Chinese culture, status is real. Age, birth order, education, money, and in gay spaces, looks and masculinity all confer rank. Men said that whoever had more of these markers often had more power in the relationship and in the community. Fourth, indirect communication. Because open confrontation is discouraged, people hint, withdraw, or act instead of saying things. So, for example, instead of saying, I want an open relationship, someone just cheats. Or instead of saying, I can't accept you're gay, a parent slowly cuts financial support. The goal is harmony, but the outcome is often more relationship damage. So the fifth theme is enmeshment. In Minuchin's terms, this would look too close, but participants said that this is just how Chinese families are. Parents enter your space, you protect family face, and you owe them responsiveness. That makes coming out high risk because the cost can be the entire support system. The sixth theme of cultural conflict. So mainstream Chinese settings prize harmony and sameness. Gay communities, especially online or in large cities, are more diverse and more accepting. Men said that they were learning inclusivity in the gay community and then getting angry when their parents stayed conservative. So there's a two-way tension between a non-diverse home culture and a more diverse gay subculture. So theme 7, cognitive biases. Men reported that parents often held very stereotyped views. Gay men must have HIV, or must be effeminate, or must be psychologically unhealthy. Those beliefs increase shame and delay disclosure. Inside the gay community, there are biases too. Popular men may assume less visible men are nobodies, and less visible men may assume popular men are promiscuous. Eighth is the theme of interplay. Lynn is clear that these three arenas don't operate in isolation. Family expectations shape how you set up roles in your couple. If family rejects you, you may compensate by spending more time in the gay community. And if you become very visible in the community, your family may experience new anxiety. It's a constant loop. So for therapy, Lynn's main warning is don't pathologize what is cultural. Indirect talk, closeness with parents, even hierarchical couple roles may be cultural starting points, not dysfunction. A good assessment will map all three arenas: what's happening in the family, in the current relationship, and in gay social spaces. It's also useful to help clients name masculinist and status logic they've internalized, because these logics often produce shame for feminine men and power imbalances in couples. And finally, Western equality focused models may need to be softened or reframed so they don't collude with Confucian respect for hierarchy. Lynn also stresses limits. This was 14 men recruited online, so likely more urban, more connected, maybe more out. We should not universalize these themes to every Chinese gay man, especially those in rural areas or with different class backgrounds. But as a cultural map for therapists, it's extremely useful. It tells us what to ask about and what not to assume. So then our final reading, Illness Beliefs of Chinese American Immigrants with Major Depressive Disorder. So Chen and colleagues in 2015 studied how Chinese American immigrants with major depressive disorder think about their illness. This study is important because underuse of mental health services among Chinese Americans is well documented, and illness beliefs are one mechanism that can either pull people toward care or keep them away. So everything I present from here will draw on this article. So why this matters. Chinese Americans as a group are less likely to use specialty mental health care than white Americans, even when they're depressed. One major reason is how people understand their illness, what they think it is, what caused it, and whether it's shameful. Earlier classic work, like Kleinman's, suggested Chinese patients mostly present with physical complaints, but that work was mostly in Asia and several decades ago. Chen and colleagues wanted to know, is this still true for Chinese immigrants now in a US primary care setting? So the purpose of this was pretty straightforward. First, it was to describe in detail how this specific group thinks about depression. Second, to do it with a standardized instrument, the EMIC, the Explanatory Model Interview Catalog, so the findings are structured and comparable. Third, to line it up against similar sample seen 10 years earlier in the same healthcare center to see what's changed. And finally, to pull out what clinicians can actually use. This was not a tiny convenience sample. Over 24,000 Chinese immigrant patients in primary care were screened with a Chinese PHQ-9. People who scored 10 or higher were invited into the depression trial. 190 of those had major depressive disorder confirmed by the MINI and then completed the EMIC in Chinese. The EMIC let the researchers ask in a culturally sensitive way, what's bothering you? What do you call it? What caused it? Who would you tell? And where would you go for help? That's the backbone of the data we're looking at. The sample is recognizably primary care and recognizably immigrant. About 2/3 women, average age around 50, more than half with less than a high school education, and depression severity in the moderately severe range. So we're not looking at highly acculturated, English dominant Chinese Americans. This is a relatively low acculturated group accessing care through a community health center. That makes the findings about psychological labeling even more striking. Contrary to the old story, the number one thing people said was wrong was mood. About 52% said something like, I'm unhappy, I'm depressed, or my mood is bad. About 39% pointed to current stress, things like family, work, money. About a third mentioned classic bodily depressive symptoms like poor sleep or appetite. Only about 10% led with non-depressive physical symptoms. So in this sample, psychological presentation actually outpaced somatic presentation. That's a key update. When asked privately, what do you call this? About 1/3 said basically, I'm depressed. And another 1/3 said this is depression in the clinical sense. So they have the Western name, but when asked, okay, what would you call it if you were telling someone else? 40% said they wouldn't tell anyone at all, and only about 9% would use the formal word depression. That tells us two things at once. The concept is understood, but it's also socially dangerous. One of the most important findings is that stigma scores were higher than in the earlier Boston study that used the same instrument. So, over roughly a decade, people became more willing to think in psychological terms, but at the same time, more likely to see the problem as stigmatizing and to conceal it. That's a really interesting tension. Acculturation to Western depression models may increase stigma because now the illness is understood as mental. When they were asked what's the most likely cause of this, 2/3 pointed to life problems. The single biggest bucket was relationship stress, especially marriage. Work stress and other family conflict were next. A noticeable slice pointed to migration related issues such as loneliness, language, and immigration hassles. Only a minority said this is a medical or biochemical illness. So even though they can name depression, they are explaining it in situational and interpersonal terms, which is very consistent with Chinese cultural emphasis on family harmony and role fulfillment. Help seeking was overwhelmingly informal. 3/4 said the most helpful response would be something they do themselves or with lay supports. Very few people named psychiatry or psychotherapy as most helpful, even though they were in a depression trial. So we have a group that can say, I'm depressed, but still prefers non-professional, non-medical responses. That's a key mismatch when how our systems are with how our systems are organized. When the authors compared these results to Yen and Cam's 1998-1999 data from the same clinic, two shifts stood out. First, people have moved from mainly somatic to mainly psychological language. Second, fewer people say, I don't know what this is. So knowledge and psychological mindedness seem to have increased. But third, stigma scores also went up, and nearly half said they wouldn't tell anyone. So learning the Western diagnosis did not make the problem more shareable. It may have made it less shareable, which is a key takeaway. So for clinicians, there are 5 practical points. 1, go ahead and ask about feeling depressed. This sample shows people will say it. 2, don't assume they'll tell family. Some will actively hide it, so discuss confidentiality. 3, make stigma reduction part of care. Education, normalization, sometimes family education. 4, connect the treatment to the stressor the patient named, your marriage or your job or your isolation, so treatment feels relevant. And 5, don't dismiss self-help. Build on it and then add professional care rather than replacing it. That's more consistent with the help-seeking pattern we see.